July 2025. Sri Lanka's Supreme Court orders the largest environmental payout in maritime history. $1 billion for a single spill of plastic pellets. The shipping company's CEO warns any payment could set a dangerous precedent. Meanwhile, Europe finally bans these pellets after decades of failed promises, just as a Spanish beach is buried under a viral white tide. Millions of plastic particles washing up overnight. The official numbers: 230,000 tons lost to the ocean every year. Invisible disasters almost no one reports. Why these tiny pellets won't stop wrecking our coasts is a story of global pollution, legal battles, and a crisis hiding in plain sight. But how did it get so bad? And who really pays the price? July 2025. Inside Sri Lanka's highest court, a panel of justices delivers a 361-page verdict that instantly echoes around the world. The court orders the owners and operators of the Express Pearl to pay $1 billion in compensation, by far the largest environmental penalty ever handed down for a maritime disaster. Their reasoning is blunt. The company, the court finds, concealed the ship's hazardous state, failed to warn port officials about leaking nitric acid, and violated the constitutional rights of thousands who depend on these waters for their livelihoods. The judgment goes further than any before it, directing that the first $250 million must be paid into an independent fund by September, with criminal proceedings threatened for non-compliance. The message is unambiguous. In the words of maritime law expert Dan Malika Gunasekera, this is a strong message that environmental crimes cannot go unchecked, even when committed by powerful transnational actors. For Sri Lanka, the ruling is about more than compensation. It is a test of whether the polluter pays principle can be enforced against global shipping giants operating far from their home ports. But the ink is barely dry before the backlash begins. Express Feeders, the Singapore-based operator, issues a public statement rejecting the court's authority. CEO Shmuel Yoskovitz calls the order a hanging guillotine and warns that any payment could set a dangerous precedent. The company insists it followed international conventions and that liability should be capped under global maritime law, pointing to a London court's earlier decision to limit exposure to just $25 million. Insurers echo the position, claiming all obligations have been met under current rules. Behind closed doors, internal memos urge delay and coordination with international legal teams. Appeals are filed in Singapore and the UK, while Sri Lankan authorities prepare to trace assets and seek help from foreign courts. The world is left watching a legal standoff with no clear end, as the question of who pays for environmental catastrophe hangs in the balance. December 2023. On the northern coast of Spain, a single video changes how millions see the ocean. Luca Martio, a professional surfer, stands ankle-deep in what looks like a snowdrift. But this isn't snow. It's a dense layer of plastic pellets, nurdles, stretching far down the Galician shoreline. In her hands, she scoops up thousands at once. The footage, posted to her social media, spreads within hours. By the end of the week, it's been shared and viewed by millions, picked up by national news, and replayed on screens across Europe. The images are hard to ignore. Children digging through white drifts, volunteers filling buckets. The familiar blue Atlantic turned strange and unfamiliar. For most people, this is the first time they've seen what 26,000 kilograms of pellets looks like after a single container spill. But the numbers behind the images are even harder to grasp. Industry reports estimate that every year, more than 230,000 tons of these pellets vanish into the world's oceans. That's over 10 trillion individual nurdles, enough to blanket every coastline on Earth, several times over. The loss isn't just a Spanish problem or a freak accident. It's routine, written into the cost of doing business. On social media, the reaction is immediate. Thousands of comments flood in, demanding answers from shipping lines and government officials. Hashtags trend in Spain, then in France and Portugal, as the pellets wash ashore on new beaches. For a brief moment, the invisible becomes visible. The scale of the disaster isn't measured in barrels or in oil slicks, but in the handfuls of plastic that anyone can pick up. Each nurdle is a building block for bottles, packaging, and everyday products, now scattered across sand and tide pools. The story that started with a court's billion-dollar judgment now finds its echo in the hands of ordinary people, staring at a problem too small to see, but too big to ignore. One container, lost from the Maersk Tokonau in December 2023, scattered 26,000 kilograms of plastic pellets along more than 400 miles of European coastline. From Galicia to the Basque Country, pellets washed ashore in thick bands, covering coves and beaches that had never seen industrial pollution before. Local authorities scrambled for data as the spill spread across borders, while Maersk's official acknowledgement lagged behind the visible evidence. Volunteers filled sacks and buckets, but the volume dwarfed any community effort. In Sri Lanka, the scale was even harder to comprehend. When the Express Pearl burned and sank off Colombo in May 2021, 1,680 tons of nurdles, about 75 billion individual pellets, spilled into the surf. Cleanup teams measured their progress in tons per day at first, but the numbers fell quickly as the pellets drifted, buried themselves in sand, or vanished into the open ocean. The disaster blanketed 80 kilometers of coastline and triggered a fishing ban that lasted 3 weeks. For local fishers and families, the plastic appeared overnight and stayed for months, outlasting the news cycle and most official visits. Hong Kong faced its own crisis in 2012, when Typhoon Vicente battered the Pearl River Delta and ruptured containers loaded with 150 tons of pellets bound for Sinopec. The storm scattered nurdles across city beaches and mangroves, and the initial response stalled as authorities debated who was responsible. It took weeks for the scale to become clear, and months before most of the visible pellets were gone. Yet, independent surveys continued to find plastic buried in the sand years later. In 2017, the MSC Susanna lost 49 tons of pellets off the coast of South Africa. Currents carried them across the Indian Ocean, and within a year, pellets identical in size and color were found on beaches in Western Australia and the remote islands of the southern Atlantic. Each spill followed its own path, but the outcome was always the same: millions of pellets, dispersed across continents, outpacing every attempt at recovery or control. The World Shipping Council keeps a running count of containers lost at sea. Its latest 5-year average stands at 1,382 containers every year, each one a steel box packed with goods, chemicals, or in hundreds of cases, plastic pellets. But most of these losses never appear in headlines or official environmental reports. Data analysts and marine researchers have spent years cross-checking shipping manifests with incident logs. Their findings reveal a pattern. Pellet spills are underreported, misclassified, or simply vanish from the public record, especially when ships fly flags of convenience or travel the busiest Asia-Europe routes. A single lost container can release enough nurdles to match the plastic in hundreds of millions of bottles. Yet without hazardous cargo status, these spills slip through regulatory cracks. Media audits show that while oil spills dominate coverage, nurdle incidents rarely make it beyond local news, if they are reported at all. Researchers piecing together satellite data and shoreline surveys estimate that dozens of significant pellet losses occur every year, most of them unacknowledged. The true number remains hidden by gaps in shipping logs and the absence of mandatory reporting. Industry data shows that the problem isn't just rare disasters. Chronic losses happen during every stage of the supply chain: loading, unloading, even routine handling at ports. Over time, these steady leaks add up to a global crisis. The scale is hard to visualize. 230,000 tons of pellets lost annually is more than 10 trillion individual pieces. That's enough to fill every swimming pool in Europe, or to build a plastic wall stretching around the equator. For investigators, the numbers tell a story of systemic risk, one where the majority of spills are invisible by design, and the true environmental cost is scattered across beaches, estuaries, and open water, far from the eyes of regulators or the public. Cleanup crews arrived in Durban, South Africa, in 2017 with a clear goal: recover as many plastic pellets as possible before they vanished into the environment. For the first few weeks, progress seemed promising. Teams collected up to 5 tons in the opening month, using everything from hand sieves to industrial vacuums. But the numbers soon told a different story. Recovery rates dropped sharply, falling below 1/10 of a ton per day after just 2 months. By the end of 3 years, the official tally reached 78%, considered the best documented recovery in any major pellet spill. Yet even that left millions of nurdles unaccounted for, scattered across 3 continents. The Express Pearl disaster in Sri Lanka followed the same pattern. In the first days, workers pulled 300 to 400 kilograms from the beaches each day. Within a few weeks, that figure dropped to just 3 or 4 kilograms. Engineers and field scientists tracked the decline, watching as pellets became buried in sand, swept out by tides, or mixed so thoroughly with the shoreline that they were nearly impossible to separate. The equipment available, manual sieves, vacuums, rotary trommels, could not keep up. Oil spill technology, designed for liquids, proved useless against solid microplastics. Dr. Peter Ryan, who led several of these operations, described the challenge bluntly. Once nurdles are dispersed or buried, recovery becomes statistically impossible. Even after official cleanups ended, pellets continued to reappear on beaches after storms or high tides. The decay curve is steep and unforgiving. Every extra kilogram recovered takes exponentially more effort, and the remaining pellets blend deeper into the environment with each passing day. Plastic pellets, known as nurdles, are more than just litter. In the water, each pellet acts as a miniature chemical sponge. Studies by marine toxicologists show that nurdles quickly absorb persistent organic pollutants like PCBs, PFAS, and heavy metals from their surroundings. These chemicals, already present in seawater, become concentrated on the surface of the plastic. When a container load of nurdles spills, it doesn't just add plastic to the ocean, it creates millions of new vectors for toxic contamination. The Express Pearl disaster brought a new dimension to this risk. The fire that engulfed the vessel left behind not just unburnt pellets, but also a vast quantity of blackened, chemically altered nurdles. Laboratory analysis found that these burnt pellets carried up to 3 times more hazardous compounds than their unburnt counterparts. Dioxins, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and other complex byproducts were detected at levels rarely seen in marine plastic debris. These compounds are known to disrupt hormones, damage organs, and persist in animal tissue for years. Marine biologists tracking the aftermath collected fish, shrimp, and plankton from affected waters. Chemical assays detected traces of pellet-borne toxins in every species tested. Fish that ingested nurdles showed signs of digestive blockage, malnutrition, and, in some cases, chemical-induced organ damage. Plankton communities exposed to microplastic contamination exhibited abnormal growth and reduced population viability. As these toxins move up the food web, they accumulate in larger predators, including those caught for human consumption. The result is a contamination pathway that starts with a pellet and can end on a dinner plate. In 1992, the world's largest plastics producers launched Operation Clean Sweep, a voluntary code meant to keep pellets out of the sea. The promise was simple: train workers, improve storage, sweep up spills. But 3 decades later, the numbers have barely moved. Annual losses still top 230,000 tons, and there's no independent audit or penalty for failing to comply. International shipping law offers little more. Under the rules set by the International Maritime Organization, nurdles are classified as non-hazardous cargo. They don't appear on the IMDG Code's dangerous goods list, and they're not listed as marine pollutants in MARPOL Annex 3. That means ships carrying billions of pellets don't need special packaging, warning labels, or pollution prevention paperwork. If a container goes overboard, there's no obligation to report the loss or trigger a cleanup under international treaty. When disaster strikes, insurers step in, but only up to the limits set by the London Limitation Convention. For non-hazardous cargo, that cap can be as low as a few $1,000,000, no matter how much damage is done. After the Express Pearl, insurers cited these rules to argue that their obligations ended at $25 million, less than 3% of what Sri Lanka's Supreme Court ordered. The rest of the cost falls to governments, coastal communities, and taxpayers. Industry lobbyists call the system balanced. They warn that stricter rules would drive up costs and unfairly shift the burden of proof onto carriers. But as voluntary codes stall and treaty gaps persist, the true price of pellet pollution is quietly paid by those with the least power to prevent it. On the beaches of Sri Lanka, the silence left by the fishing ban was unmistakable. For 22 days, boats remained pulled ashore, nets stacked and drying in the sun. The government closed an 80-kilometer stretch of coastline, cutting off thousands of families from their only source of income. Fishers kept daily diaries, tallying lost earnings and watching as uncertainty grew. Some recorded their children asking when they could return to the water. Others described sleepless nights, waiting for news that never came. Wildlife rescue teams, meanwhile, faced a different kind of crisis. In the weeks after the Express Pearl disaster, more than 400 dead sea turtles were collected along the coast. Many showed burns, swollen eyes, or plastic lodged in their stomachs. Veterinary reports confirmed the injuries matched chemical exposure and pellet ingestion. Dolphins and even a handful of whales washed up with similar wounds. Field workers documented each animal, snapping photos and collecting tissue samples for evidence. In Spain, the response looked different, but carried the same urgency. Within 48 hours of the Galician spill, over 2,000 volunteers joined cleanups organized through WhatsApp and TikTok. People arrived with kitchen strainers, pasta sieves, and buckets, sifting through sand for hours. The work was slow and the volume overwhelming, but the effort spread quickly along the coast. Some volunteers kept records of how many sacks they filled, while others mapped the worst-hit areas for later surveys. Across the globe, citizen science networks like Nurdle Patrol have grown to more than 11,000 volunteers in over 30 countries. Their surveys, now numbering 25,000, create a living map of pellet pollution, often filling gaps left by official reports. In many places, these community efforts are the only ongoing source of data. Yet, despite the scale of the problem and the energy of those on the ground, most coverage remains limited to social media or local news. For many affected families and volunteers, the sense of being left alone with the problem is as persistent as the pellets themselves. Every year, an estimated 230,000 tons of plastic pellets enter the world's oceans, as confirmed by industry data. Decades of major spills, from Hong Kong in 2012 to Spain in 2023, have shown that recovery is almost impossible once these 1 to 5 millimeter pellets disperse. The Sri Lankan Supreme Court's $1 billion judgment in 2025 stands as the largest maritime environmental fine in history. Yet Express feeders' refusal to pay highlights the ongoing gap between legal rulings and corporate accountability. Despite new regulations in the European Union, international shipping still classifies plastic pellets as non-hazardous, leaving oversight and enforcement inconsistent. Scientific studies continue to reveal health and ecological risks, but the full impact on marine life and human communities is not yet fully understood. What is clear, as documented across continents, is that every plastic product begins with these pellets, and their loss at sea remains a persistent, largely invisible crisis with consequences that extend far beyond the shore.